September 12, 1944. Camp Gley, Colorado. The Rocky Mountains stood like silent sentinels in the distance as a transport truck rumbled through the gates of a prisoner of war facility nestled in the high desert plains. Inside, 43 German women sat in tense silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty from the long journey across the Atlantic, and then across this vast, incomprehensible country called America. They had been captured in France during the Allied advance, plucked from their posts as radio operators, nurses, and administrative personnel for the Wehrmacht. Now they were being delivered to an enemy camp in a landscape so foreign it might as well have been the moon. Among them sat 24-year-old Greta Hoffmann, a former communications specialist from Munich. She clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she owned in the world: one extra uniform, a comb, and a photograph of her family standing outside their bakery on Marienplatz. The truck lurched to a stop, and American guards gestured for the women to disembark. Their faces were young, these American soldiers, some barely out of boyhood. Greta had expected hatred in their eyes, the same propaganda-fueled contempt she had been taught to feel toward them. Instead, she saw mostly curiosity and something that looked almost like awkward uncertainty. The women were processed quickly, assigned bunks in a long wooden barracks, and told that dinner would be served at 1800 hours. 6 o'clock. One of the guards clarified in broken German, seeing their confusion. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Greta painfully of Bavarian sunsets, the prisoners were led to a mess hall. The building smelled of wood smoke and something else, something unfamiliar and slightly sweet. Long tables were arranged in rows, and metal trays had been set out at each place. American soldiers stood behind a serving line, and for a moment, the absurdity of the scene struck Greta with almost hysterical force. They were going to be served food by their enemies, as if this were some kind of bizarre restaurant rather than a prison camp. What appeared on her tray made Greta stop in her tracks. There, nestled in a split white bread roll that looked nothing like proper German bread, sat a pink tube of meat, glistening slightly in the fluorescent light. It was topped with a stripe of yellow mustard and what appeared to be some kind of red sauce. The woman behind her, Liesel Braun from Hamburg, actually gasped. "Was ist das?" she whispered. The American soldier doing the serving, a freckled young man with red hair, smiled broadly. "Hot dog," he announced proudly, as if he had just presented them with a delicacy. "Best food in America." The German women stared at their trays in collective bewilderment. Greta looked down at the tube of meat, then back at the American soldier. Surely, she thought, surely he couldn't mean what she thought he meant. The mess hall filled with the sounds of scraping chairs and hushed German voices as the women took their seats. Greta sat next to Liesel and across from Anna Weber, a 21-year-old nurse from Berlin who had been captured while tending to wounded soldiers at a field hospital. All three stared at the peculiar food before them with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. The hot dog sat in its pale bun like some kind of culinary imposter, nothing like the proud sausages they had known their entire lives. Liesel picked up her fork tentatively, prodding the pink meat as if it might spring to life. "This is supposed to be sausage?" she asked in disbelief. "It looks like something made in a factory, not a butcher shop." Anna leaned closer, examining the texture. "My father was a Metzger in Berlin," she said quietly. "He would weep if he saw this. Where is the snap of natural casing? Where is the proper seasoning? This looks like it was made from the proper to was an extent. With as of the pieced, to a vented s manner, was nother saying, mystery meat and pressed into a tube." Greta thought of her own family's bakery, where they had partnered with the butcher next door every autumn to make traditional Bavarian Weisswurst. She remembered watching Herr Kraus select the finest veal and pork, grinding it fresh each morning, mixing it with parsley and lemon and white pepper. The sausages had been works of art, pale and delicate, served in hot water with sweet mustard and fresh pretzels. This American thing before her seemed to mock everything she knew about proper sausage making. Around the mess hall, other German women were having similar reactions. Some had picked up their hot dogs with their hands, unsure whether this was finger food or required utensils. Others simply stared, unable to bring themselves to taste something so alien. One woman, Margarete Schmidt from Cologne, had tears running down her cheeks. "My husband and I used to go to the Christmas markets," she said to no one in particular. "The smell of bratwurst and good luck wine, the snow falling on the cathedral. Will I ever smell those things again?" The mention of Christmas markets triggered a wave of homesickness throughout the room. These women had been soldiers of sorts, yes, but they had also been daughters and sisters and wives. They had grown up in cities where sausage making was an art form passed down through generations, where each region had its own proud traditions. Nürnberger Rostbratwurst, small and spiced with marjoram. Thüringer, with its garlic and caraway. The coarse, hearty currywurst that had become popular in recent years. Each variety told a story of place and heritage and family. Now they sat in a strange land, being offered something called a hot dog by soldiers whose country they had been taught to hate. Greta finally picked up the bun, feeling the soft, almost sweet bread compress under her fingers. She lifted it to her nose and inhaled. It smelled of smoke and salt and something indefinably American. Taking a deep breath, she brought it to her lips and took her first bite. The taste was unexpected, not unpleasant exactly, but completely foreign to everything Greta knew about sausage. The meat was soft, almost spongy, with a mild smoky flavor that lacked the complexity of German spices. The mustard was sharp and vinegary, and the red sauce, which she later learned was called ketchup, had an odd sweetness that made her wrinkle her nose. Around her, other women were taking their first cautious bites, their faces registering similar confusion. Liesel chewed slowly, as if trying to identify mysterious ingredients. "It tastes like childhood, and sadness had a baby," she announced, which made Anna snort despite herself. The red-haired American soldier who had served them was making rounds through the mess hall, checking on the prisoners with an earnestness that seemed almost comical. When he approached their table, Greta noticed his name tag read Sullivan. "How do you like it?" he asked in enthusiastic but mangled German. "Gut, ja?" Anna looked up at him with genuine curiosity overcoming her caution. "Why?" she asked in careful English. "Is it called hot dog? There is no dog in this, yes?" Private Tommy Sullivan's face broke into the widest grin Greta had ever seen. He pulled up a chair, apparently delighted to have been asked this question. "Oh boy, you're gonna love this," he said, speaking slowly so they could understand. "Nobody really knows for sure, but there's this story, right? Back in the 1870s, there were German immigrants selling sausages from carts, calling them Dachshund sausages because they looked like those long little dogs. The German women leaned in despite themselves, curious now." Sullivan continued, clearly enjoying his role as cultural ambassador. "So this cartoonist at a baseball game, he wanted to draw the sausage vendor, but he couldn't spell Dachshund. So he just called them hot dogs instead, and the name stuck." He slapped the table, laughing at the absurdity of his own country's food history. For a moment, the mess hall seemed suspended in time. Here was an American soldier, barely older than 20, laughing about the stupidity of a food name to a group of enemy prisoners. And despite everything, despite the war and the uniforms and the barbed wire outside, the German women found themselves smiling. Liesel was the first to actually laugh, a sound that surprised everyone, including herself. "So it is named after a German dog because Americans cannot spell?" she asked, her English improving with her amusement. "This is the most American thing I have ever heard." Sullivan beamed at her, apparently taking this as a compliment. "We're real good at taking things from other countries and making them weird," he admitted proudly. "Wait till you try pizza. Italians would probably shoot us for what we did to that." More women were listening now, drawn by the sound of laughter in a place where they expected only grimness. Anna picked up her hot dog again, looking at it with new understanding. It was ridiculous, this food. But perhaps, she thought, ridiculous was better than hateful. Over the following days, hot dogs became a strange constant in the camp routine. They appeared at lunch, at dinner, sometimes even at breakfast alongside eggs and something the Americans called hash browns. Each time, The German women approached them with slightly less suspicion and slightly more willingness to experiment. The real revelation came when Private Sullivan set up what he called a condiment station in the mess hall. He arranged bottles and jars on a long table with the pride of a museum curator presenting priceless artifacts. "Ladies," he announced in his fractured German, "today you learn the American way." He gestured grandly at his collection. Yellow mustard, brown mustard, something called relish that looked like chopped pickles suspended in green gel, ketchup, mayonnaise, and mysterious squeeze. Bottles labeled with words the women couldn't read. Greta stood before this bewildering array, feeling utterly lost. In Munich, there had been sweet mustard for Weisswurst and sharp mustard for other sausages. The rules were clear and established over centuries. This chaos of choices seemed deliberately designed to confuse. Anna picked up the relish jar, examining the chunks floating inside. "This looks like what happens when cucumbers have a terrible accident," she observed, which made several nearby women giggle. Liesel was braver, squirting a zigzag pattern of ketchup and mustard across her hot dog with artistic flair. "If we are prisoners," she declared, "at least we can be prisoners who make art with our food." She took a large bite, chewed thoughtfully, and her eyes widened. "It is absolutely ridiculous," she announced, "but also not terrible." Encouraged by her boldness, others began experimenting. Marguerite tried mustard and relish together, making a face that suggested immediate regret but continuing to eat anyway. Rosa Zimmermann, a quiet woman from Frankfurt who rarely spoke, created an elaborate combination of all available condiments, producing something that looked more like a science experiment than food. When she tasted it, she shrugged. "I have eaten worse in the military," she said simply, which was probably true. Private Sullivan watched their experiments with obvious delight, offering suggestions and occasionally demonstrating proper American technique. "You gotta squirt it in a line, see? Not just blob it on there." He showed them how to layer the condiments, how to add the relish in the groove of the hot dog so it wouldn't fall out. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon the mess hall filled with a sound that had been absent since their capture: genuine laughter. Greta found herself creating what she privately called the Munich Compromise, a careful balance of mustard and just a thin line of ketchup. It would horrify her father, she knew, but there was something liberating about breaking rules in such a small, harmless way. As she ate, she watched Anna teaching Sullivan a few German words while he taught her American slang. She observed Liesel making elaborate condiment patterns, her artistic nature finding expression even here. These tiny moments of normalcy, of human connection over something as absurd as decorated hot dogs, felt like small rebellions against the grinding machinery of war. July 4, 1945. The war in Europe had ended 2 months earlier, but the German women remained at Camp Gley in a strange limbo, awaiting repatriation orders that seemed perpetually delayed. On this particular morning, the camp underwent a transformation that left the prisoners bewildered. American flags appeared everywhere, red, white, and blue bunting draped across buildings, and the guards moved with an energy the women had never witnessed before. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the senior female officer overseeing the compound, gathered the German prisoners in the main yard. She was a tall woman from Virginia with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that the women had come to respect. "Today is Independence Day," she explained in clear, slow English that most of them could now understand. "It is America's birthday. We celebrate with family, fireworks, and food, especially hot dogs." She paused, allowing this to sink in. "We would like to invite you to join our celebration." The invitation hung in the air like an impossible thing. Enemy prisoners invited to celebrate their captor's national holiday? Greta exchanged glances with Anna and Liesel, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. But Lieutenant Mitchell was already directing them toward an area behind the mess hall where something extraordinary had been constructed. 3 large metal grills stood in a row, already radiating heat. Tables had been set up with checkered cloths, and mountains of hot dog buns rose like bread, pyramids beside enormous bowls of potato salad, coleslaw, and baked beans. Private Sullivan stood by the grills wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the Cook," wielding long metal tongs like a conductor's baton. "Welcome to a real American cookout," he announced proudly. Beside him, Sergeant James Crawford, a quiet man from Georgia, was already laying hot dogs on the grill. The sizzle and snap of meat meeting hot metal filled the air, and the smell was intoxicating. This was different from the boiled hot dogs they had been eating. These were being transformed by fire and smoke, their casings crisping and splitting in ways that released deeper, richer aromas. For the next hour, the German women watched in fascination as the Americans demonstrated their national obsession with grilled meat. Sullivan explained that real hot dogs, the kind you ate at baseball games and backyard parties, had to be grilled with those perfect char marks. Crawford showed them how to toast the buns directly on the grill for a few seconds, creating a texture that was crispy outside and soft inside. Other soldiers set up what they called a hot dog bar, with even more condiments than the women had seen before. Sauerkraut appeared, which made the German prisoners laugh with recognition. "You stole this from us," Liesel accused playfully, and Sullivan admitted shamelessly that America had stolen most of its good foods from somewhere else. As the celebration continued, something shifted in the camp's atmosphere. American soldiers and German prisoners stood side by side at the grills, speaking in mixed German and English, laughing at shared jokes about food and home and the absurdity of celebrating freedom with people who technically weren't free. That evening, after the 4th of July celebration had ended and the grills had cooled, Greta sat on her bunk with a pad of paper and a pencil. Around her, other women were doing the same, writing letters they all knew would never be sent. The International Red Cross had managed to deliver a few messages over the past months, but most had received no word from home. They had no way of knowing if their families still lived, if their homes still stood, if the Germany they remembered even existed anymore. Greta began writing to her mother, describing the day's events with a detail that felt almost desperate. "Dearest Mutti," she wrote in her careful script, "today I ate a sausage that was cooked over an open flame by my enemy, and it was delicious. I know this sounds like madness. Perhaps I have gone mad. The Americans have a holiday where they celebrate their independence by eating vast quantities of these hot dogs, which are not actually dogs but rather small sausages that would make father weep with their lack of proper technique." She paused, reading what she had written. It sounded absurd even to her own eyes. How could she explain that she had spent the afternoon laughing with American soldiers, learning to grill meat, feeling almost happy? Across the barracks, Anna was writing to her father, the butcher. "Papa, you would have strong opinions about American sausage making. They use mechanically separated meat, whatever that means, and they boil everything or char it over flames. There is no subtlety, no tradition. And yet, Papa, when you bite into a hot dog that has been properly grilled, with the outside crispy and the inside still juicy, topped with their strange sweet relish and sharp mustard, something happens. It tastes like summer and carelessness, and not being at war." Liesel was writing to her younger sister, whom she hadn't seen since 1943. "Katha, do you remember how we used to dream about traveling to America? We would look at those propaganda posters showing American wealth and excess, and secretly, even though we weren't supposed to, we would wonder what it would be like to visit such a place. Well, I am here now, and it is nothing like what we were told. The Americans are wasteful, yes, and loud, and they have no appreciation for proper bread or beer. But they are also generous in ways I never expected. Today they shared their national celebration with us, their prisoners. They grilled meat for us and taught us their food customs and treated us almost like guests instead of enemies." Marguerite Schmidt sat on the edge of her bunk, not writing but staring at a blank page. Finally, she began a letter to her husband, not knowing if he was alive or dead, captured or killed in the final days of fighting. "Liebster Martin, I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not know if you are even alive to read this. But I need to tell someone what is happening to me here, in this strange place. I am forgetting how to hate. The Americans make it very difficult to maintain proper hatred when they keep feeding us and laughing with us and showing us kindness. 3 days after the 4th of July celebration, Private Sullivan approached Greta with an unexpected proposal. "You want to learn to cook?" he asked, gesturing toward the grills that still stood behind the mess hall. "Real American grilling, not just watching." Greta looked at him with surprise, uncertain if this was permitted or even wise. But Lieutenant Mitchell had apparently approved the idea, seeing it as a way to keep the prisoners occupied during their indefinite wait for repatriation orders. By mid-morning, a group of 12 German women stood around the grills, while Sullivan and Sergeant Crawford conducted what they grandly called the Camp Gley Grilling Academy. The sun beat down on the Colorado high plains, and the metal grills shimmered with heat. Sullivan handed out long-handled tongs to each woman, demonstrating the proper grip with exaggerated seriousness. "The tongs are an extension of your arm," he explained in his improving German. "You must become one with the tongs." Anna could not suppress her laughter at his solemn tone. "You make it sound like we are learning sword fighting, not cooking sausages," she said. Crawford, who rarely smiled, actually grinned at this. "Ma'am, in America, grilling is a sacred art. Men have fought wars over whether charcoal or propane is better." He said this with such a straight face that the women could not tell if he was joking. The lesson began with proper grill preparation. Crawford showed them how to oil the grates using a rag on a stick, preventing the hot dogs from sticking. Sullivan demonstrated heat zones, explaining that different areas of the grill cooked at different intensities. You want to start them on high heat to get the snap and the char marks, then move them to cooler areas to finish cooking through. Liesel took her position at one of the grills, tongs in hand like a warrior preparing for battle. When Sullivan placed raw hot dogs on the grate in front of her, she approached them with the same concentration she had once applied to sorting military communications. She turned them carefully, watching for the telltale split in the casing that indicated they were cooking properly. Rosa Zimmerman, who had been so quiet for months, suddenly came alive at the grill. She had a natural instinct for heat and timing, rotating her hot dogs with practiced precision. "My grandfather had a smokehouse in Frankfurt," she explained when others complimented her technique. "I spent summers learning to smoke meat. This is not so different, just faster and with less patience required." The American soldiers began bringing other foods to practice on. Hamburgers appeared, thick patties of ground beef that required different timing than hot dogs. Sullivan showed them how to press a thumb into the center to test for doneness, how to toast the buns at just the right moment, how to let the meat rest before serving. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable happened. The line between teacher and student blurred. The German women began sharing their own knowledge, explaining German grilling techniques, describing how different regions prepared meat differently. Anna taught Sullivan about the proper internal temperature for bratwurst. Greta explained Bavarian beer garden cooking traditions. August 17, 1945. The day began like any other at Camp Gley, with the women rising at dawn, attending to their assigned duties, and gathering for the breakfast that now felt routine. But Lieutenant Mitchell's face when she entered the mess hall told them something had changed. She carried a stack of newspapers and telegrams, and her usual composure seemed strained. "Ladies," she said quietly, "we have received updated information from Germany. News about your cities and families." The room fell silent. For months, they had received only fragments of information about the devastation in their homeland. Now, it seemed, the full picture was finally emerging. Mitchell began reading names and cities, matching them with whatever information the Red Cross had been able to gather. Hoffman, Greta, Munich. Greta's heart stopped. Mitchell continued, "Your family's bakery on Marienplatz was destroyed in an April 1945 bombing raid. Your mother and younger brother survived and are currently in a displaced persons camp outside the city. Your father did not survive." The words hit Greta like physical blows. Her father, who had taught her to knead dough before she could read, who had made her laugh by creating bread animals for her birthday each year, was gone. She sat down heavily, feeling Anna's hand grip her shoulder. Around the room, similar scenes unfolded as Mitchell continued down her list. Some women learned their families had survived. Others received the news Greta had, that some had lived while others had not. Several learned that their entire families were missing, their fates unknown. Liesel discovered that Hamburg had been so thoroughly destroyed by firebombing that entire neighborhoods no longer existed. Her family's dress was simply gone, burned away in the firestorms of 1943. Margarete learned that her husband had been killed in the final days of fighting in Berlin, dying just weeks before Germany's surrender. The mess hall filled with quiet weeping, the sound of women trying to process grief too large to comprehend. But perhaps worse than the personal losses was the additional news Mitchell shared. More details had emerged about the concentration camps, about the systematic murder of millions, about the full scope of what Germany had done. Lieutenant Mitchell spread newspapers across the tables, showing photographs that made several women turn away in horror. "You need to see this," she said, not unkindly but firmly. "You need to understand what was done in your country's name." Greta looked at images of liberation at camps like Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, at faces that were barely human anymore, at piles of bodies that seemed impossible. This was the Germany she had served? This was what she had believed in? That evening, the women gathered not for dinner but for something else entirely. Without planning it, they found themselves at the grills behind the mess hall, where just weeks earlier they had laughed and learned to cook. Private Sullivan found them there, sitting in silence around the cold metal. Without a word, he began lighting the grills, and Sergeant Crawford appeared with packages of hot dogs, understanding somehow that what these women needed was not solitude, but the simple human ritual of making food together. September 23, 1945. Lieutenant Mitchell stood before the assembled German prisoners with orders from the War Department. Repatriation ships were being organized, and within 3 weeks, the women of Camp Gley would be transported to New York, then across the Atlantic to occupied Germany. They would be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. The news should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, it brought a heavy silence that settled over the barracks like snow. That night, Greta lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what returning to Germany meant. Her father was dead, her family's bakery was rubble, and her mother and brother lived in a camp not unlike this one, waiting for a future that seemed to hold nothing but hardship and shame. What would she return to? A country destroyed, occupied by foreign armies, bearing the weight of crimes so enormous that the world would never forgive them. She thought about the past 11 months at Camp Gley, about how she had arrived expecting cruelty and found instead an odd form of kindness. In the darkness, she heard Anna's voice from the next bunk. "Are you awake?" Greta confirmed she was, and soon other whispered voices joined the conversation. Liesel, Margarete, Rosa, and others, all unable to sleep, all wrestling with the same impossible questions. "I have been thinking," Anna said slowly, "about what we are returning to. My father is dead, my brothers are missing, Berlin is ruins. What exactly am I going home for?" Margarete spoke next, her voice thick with grief. "My husband died fighting for a country that committed horrors we never knew about. What does it mean to go back and rebuild that?" Rosa, who so rarely spoke, surprised them all. "Here, they taught us to grill hot dogs. It sounds stupid when I say it out loud, but what I mean is, they treated us like human beings. Like we were worth teaching something to, worth laughing with, worth trusting with fire and food and friendship. In Germany, we will be the women who surrendered, who were captured, who collaborated with the enemy by learning their language and their customs." The truth of her words settled over them all. They had been transformed by their captivity in ways they had not fully recognized until this moment. They had learned English, learned American customs, shared meals, and laughter with their former enemies. They had discovered that Americans were not the monsters they had been taught to fear, but rather ordinary people capable of both generosity and grace. Greta made a decision that seemed insane even as the words formed in her mind. "What if we asked to stay?" she whispered. The suggestion hung in the darkness like something forbidden and dangerous. "Can prisoners of war even do that?" Liesel asked. "I do not know," Greta admitted. "But perhaps we should ask. Perhaps we should choose the future we want, rather than simply accepting the one we are being sent to. By morning, 8 women had decided to make the unprecedented request. 27 years later, July 4, 1972, Denver, Colorado. The backyard of the modest suburban home filled with the familiar sizzle and snap of hot dogs meeting hot grill grates. Greta Hoffman Sullivan stood at the grill, tongs in hand, wearing an apron that read, "Grill, Sergeant." Her husband, Tommy Sullivan, brought out another platter of raw hot dogs, grinning at the assembled guests. Their 3 children ran through the yard with sparklers, shrieking with the particular joy of American children on Independence Day. Around the picnic tables sat an unlikely gathering of people whose lives had been changed by something as simple as a hot dog. Anna Weber Crawford sat with her husband James, their teenage twins helping set out potato salad and baked beans. Anna had become a registered nurse, working at Denver General Hospital, and she still remembered every moment of that first bewildering dinner at Camp Greeley. Liesl Braun Mitchell had married Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's younger brother in a scandal that the family had eventually forgiven and then celebrated. She taught German at the local high school and painted watercolors in her spare time. Rosa Zimmerman had never married, but had opened a small German-American restaurant that served both traditional bratwurst and perfectly grilled American hot dogs side by side. Not all of the 8 women who had asked to stay had remained. 2 had eventually returned to Germany after a few years, finding that home still called to them despite everything. But most had built lives here in Colorado, in this strange middle ground between the country they came from and the country that had shown them unexpected mercy. As Greta placed perfectly charred hot dogs on a platter, she thought about that morning in September 1945 when they had approached Lieutenant Mitchell with their impossible request. She remembered Mitchell's shock, her skepticism, her eventual understanding. The War Department had taken months to process their petition, creating a special classification that allowed them to transition from prisoners of war to displaced persons seeking asylum. The path had not been easy. They had faced suspicion from American communities, had carried the weight of German guilt, had struggled with language and customs, and the profound dissonance of building lives in their former enemy's homeland. But they had also found something precious, the chance to become something other than what the war had made them. Tommy brought out a tray of toasted buns, kissing Greta's cheek as he passed. She still marveled sometimes at the strangeness of her life, that she had married the red-haired soldier who had first served her a hot dog and tried to explain why it was called a dog, that they had children who spoke English as their first language and considered Germany a foreign country their mother came from. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in those same oranges and purples she remembered from her first night at Camp Greeley, Greta raised her hot dog in a toast to second chances, to absurd foods with ridiculous names, and to the strange grace of finding home in the last place you ever expected.